Well, hello and good morning to all our panelists and the participants who have all taken time to join this all-important webinar. Now, let me just run you through two quick things that are very important. One would be that we'll need you to mute your microphones when you're not on the floor. And then number two goes for your mobile phones as well. If you can put them on silent so that in the event that you have the floor, your phone does not disrupt the meeting. And number three is if you need to ask questions, kindly use the chat at the bottom and ask the questions. We have very limited time for Q&A. Hopefully we'll be able to steal a minute or two from various parts of the proceedings to ensure that we maximize the time that we have. But you can type the question so that it's concise and to the point and allows us to take as many of those questions as possible. My name is Nhyira Addo. I work with the Multimedia Group, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the webinar on the UK Bribery Act and the FCPA, the American United States Foreign Corruption Practices Act. Now, this is an anti-corruption event. It is put together by the UK GCC and the American Chamber of Commerce. So I'm Chairman UK GCC with support from private sector-led anti-corruption group, that's PSACG, and also STARK, Strengthening Action Against Corruption. And so you're all very welcome. There will be lots of things for all of us to take away. I'll be introducing our speakers in a moment. But before we do that, I would like to remind us all that this will be done by 11:30. So we will be straight to the point. Our main speaker is the founder at Egality Law, and in the person of Korieh. The law firm is a UK and Ghana regulated corporate commercial law firm. And from the time I've known Korieh, his passion for compliance and getting things right is well founded. And he will be taking us through a presentation where he will share with us the compliance, the regulatory framework that the UK Bribery Act of 2010 provides, as well as the American FCPA. We'll also be hearing from Abraham Agbozo, who's a compliance counsel for Newmont, Ghana. Abraham did his undergraduate with the University of Ghana, and then he got a JD from the Marquette University Law School in Wisconsin. Previously, he has worked with Northwestern Mutual in Milwaukee, the M&A practice group at Cravat in New York, and also with the Energy and Natural Resources practice at Bentiente Lecha and Ancoma. He joined Newmont in 2016. Julian, our other speaker, is also the country head financial crime compliance with Standard Chartered Bank Ghana. He's been with the bank for more than 22 years. He served in various roles within banking operations, internal audit and assurance. Currently, he is the head of financial crime compliance. He's also very active, or was active, in the rollout of the Financial Crime Risk Mitigation Program, which is about a massive transformation for managing financial crime risk at the bank. And this has been in place in the last 3 years. He's quite a very passionate person about his work and supportive of all stakeholders. Also, we will be hearing from the team leader at STARK. But before then, let me quickly take you through a profile of the organizers. So this is PSAG, which is the private sector-led anti-corruption group, was set up as a platform to support anti-corruption in the strengthening action against corruption, which was doing public sector, but from a private sector angle. And a long-term objective is to assess the impact of corruption, and more importantly, to also work as a tool to monitor how well Ghana is progressing in implementing and recommended measures to ensure that everything that we do is above board. Now, STARK is, of course, strengthening action against corruption. It's a program funded by the UK government's Department for International Development, now known as the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. And this project aims at strengthening and making more effective the institutions working in Ghana to reduce and prevent the adverse impact of corruption on the people and businesses in Ghana. And so that's the two. And now the two Chamber of Commerce, or Chambers of Commerce, is the American Chamber of Commerce. In Ghana is a representative arm of US businesses and subsidiaries voluntarily working to create an environment where businesses can thrive between Ghana and the United States of America. If you want to join, we'll be sharing some slides with the details on there, but you can note this down. If you go to www.amchamghana.org/how-to-join, or you can go to Facebook and look for AmCham Ghana, AmChamGhana. You can find that handle on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you should be able to join via there. The UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce was established in 2016 with the support of the UK's Department of International Trade as a member-based trade association to simply facilitate and promote bilateral trade between the UK and Ghana via three platforms: so networking, advocacy, and trade services. And so they, together with the AmCham and with the support of STARK and PSAC, have made this possible. So you're all very welcome. If you want to become a member, you can talk to the Membership Engagement Manager, Margaret, on 054-012-6619, or if you go to Facebook, look for UK-Ghana Chamber of Commerce, and you should be able to join. And if you would want to go to the web, it's ukgcc.com.gh. At this point, I'd like to hand over to our very first speaker, who is the team leader for strengthening action against corruption, and that's Howard Tucker. Howard, you're very welcome to take the floor and give us your opening remarks.
Well, thanks for the introduction. It was a good introduction, an overview of STAC and the webinar today. But honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very important webinar on corruption. And as has been described, it's organized by the Private Sector Anti-Corruption Group, or PSAC as we know them. And today's discussion, as has been referred to, is going to be concentrated on the UK's Bribery Act of 2010 and the US Foreign Corruption Practices Act. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today to open this seminar. It's a great pleasure to do so. You've already had a brief overview of STAC. It is a 5-year program, which is due to end at the end of November this year. So it's really the twilight of the organization. So it's equally important for us, I think, to be part of this seminar today. STAC has worked across stateside, CSO and public sector on various activities aimed at tackling corruption in Ghana. And many of you will be aware of this work, I'm sure. Our work with PSAC was initiated in 2018 by the UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce and was funded by STAC. It developed really from STAC's desire to establish a platform to support the anti-corruption work that STAC was already conducting with partners in the public sector, but with the perspective as seen through private sector eyes. It was certainly a gap in the work that we were doing. And this bridged the gap and enabled an accurate assessment on the impact of corruption in the private sector, and specifically the ease of which conducting such business in Ghana was available. Analysis of this process resulted in the ability to offer actionable recommendations on how to address these challenges to the government of Ghana. It also offered support by providing a collective action safe space approach for chambers and local businesses to enable discussions on common challenges faced by anybody who's conducting business in Ghana. PSAC has acted as a platform to government, as has been mentioned, to monitor the progress, both good and bad, that the government of Ghana is making on the implementation of recommended measures to tackle corruption and related bad practices. To date, this has worked very well, and PSAC's engaging regularly with the Vice President's office on behalf of your recommendations for policy change and improvements within the business environment. And thanks to the efforts of PSAC, you now have an effective platform to government and a growing membership that in the years ahead will serve the Ghanaian business community and by association the citizens of Ghana in the continuing battle against corruption. I'm sure that you will enjoy your discussions today, and I'm a little bit sad, and I apologize that I can't stay with you for the whole session, but sadly, I have an overlapping engagement I have to attend to straight after talking today. But I'm really sure this is going to be a really good debate, and my colleagues will be following it themselves here in the office. So without more delay, Midase, thank you for listening to me and your patience, and I wish you success with this debate. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Howard, and we wish you well with the rest of your engagement for the day.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Howard Tucker, the team leader at Strengthening Action Against Corruption, STAC, Ghana. We'll be moving straight into the first main presentation, and this is the presentation on the UK Bribery Act of 2010 and the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, and this will be presented to us by Korieh Duodu. And so, Korieh, I believe you are able to share your screen now. You can have the floor and go through the presentation. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nhyira, and also to Howard at STAC and everyone else at PSAG, AmCham, and the UK GCC for organizing this excellent event. So I'm Korieh Duodu, and as Nhyira said, I'm the head of a firm called Egality Law. I have some personal interest to declare on this subject. Actually, with the UK High Commission in Accra and also with the UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce, I had a former role as the former team leader of STAC itself. And at that time, back in 2017, we came up with the idea of the Private Sector Anti-Corruption Group and a safe space for corporate entities to share experiences and challenges on corruption. It was a long time ago. I now have very much another life, and it's really delightful to see how this has, taken traction and become a really important platform for discussing these issues. Another interest to declare: when the Bribery Act first was about to be enacted in the UK Trade and Industry put together a group of people to go around West Africa lecturing on the forthcoming Bribery Act and its significance in this part of the world, the extraterritorial application of the Act, which we're going to talk about. And I was one of the people from my old law firm, Addo, who went around talking about this issue. And I had a particularly edifying experience talking about the Bribery Act in Nigeria in 2011, when they knew, and we had a large group of very eminent lawyers talking about this. I started off the presentation, as one quite often does, saying, oh, well, Nigeria doesn't rank too high in the World Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, at which point the senior prosecutor of Nigeria stopped me and said, you know why we don't rank higher than 141st out of 200 countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index? I said, well, because of the corruption issues. And he said, yeah, okay, but do you know why we don't rank any lower? I said, no, please educate us. He said, because we bribed the 41 other countries below us in order to get to the position of 141 on the index, which really set the tone for discussing these issues in Nigeria. I mean, I think we've had, fantastic take-up of the corruption compliance sort of mitigation strategies, which are really required under the Bribery Act in Ghana. And we're beginning to see more traction in other parts of West Africa as well. But hopefully, this type of event and the discussion and debates we're going to have will really show, how seriously these issues are being taken in Ghana. So what am I going to cover? Well, I'm going to try not to give a law lecture. And, my objective is to really canter through the nuts and bolts of the relevant legislation. So, we'll start with bribery and corruption definitions. We'll look at the FCPA and the Bribery Act. I'm going to deal with the FCPA quite briefly because we have the privilege of having Abraham as a panelist. And Abraham is a US qualified lawyer and has worked on these issues in the US and is far better qualified than me, an English and Ghanaian lawyer, to comment on these issues. And then I think really the meat of my presentation is on thinking about mitigation strategies. So considering what is an adequate set of procedures for preventing bribery and corruption in the corporate setting, looking at some of the policy considerations, and then really coming back to what is probably the most important point to make of all when looking at the nuts and bolts of how this type of legislation work, which is the role of senior management and tone from the top. So let me leap straight into the definitions. And I'm seeing that my slides are a little bit slow. I've been introduced, so I'm going to move straight on that. Do let me know if there's any issues with the slides. They seem to be moving quite slowly for me. First of all, then, what are the basics? I think everyone knows what a bribe is, and we don't need to spend too much time on that. It's an offer or the giving of a financial or other advantage to induce someone to behave improperly. There are loads and loads of definitions around the world, but really it is as simple as that. And the improper behavior is probably the key element of bribery, which makes it generally around the world a criminal offense. And as I say, there are a number of working definitions of corruption, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which is the accepted Transparency International definition. Really, these issues depend on context, and one must always look holistically at the circumstances and the intention of the offering or the receiving, because ultimately those circumstances might give rise to a corrupt transaction, even if the primary intent is not corrupt. And we'll see that in one or two examples as I go through the discussion. So some quick examples: accepting a payment, a gift, or hospitality from a third party where it's, or you're suspecting that this is being offered in the expectation that you'll provide a business advantage for them. And let's remember that word, improper. It would most likely have to be an improper business advantage. Perhaps there is a tender going on, a competitive tender, but at the same time, there is a lavish gift or hospitality being handed to the person who's a key decision maker in the tender process. Accepting or offering a gift in relation to a government official, politicians, political parties, without prior approval. Sometimes even if you have internal prior approval, that could give rise to a very significant red flag. And we know that politically exposed persons create particular risks of corruption, and should be taken particular care when dealing with them. Doing such acts through a third party. This is a really important aspect of the context of corruption. It had often been the case that companies would try and absolve themselves of responsibility for corruption by acting through intermediaries. and ensuring the corrupt transaction isn't at their specific door. That is not going to absolve companies in the new context of legislation like the Bribery Act. And of course, now the international context is incredibly important. And a case in point, which sadly involves Ghana, is the recent huge Airbus fine in a number of jurisdictions, including the UK and the US. A plea bargain of £3 billion has been agreed with Airbus in circumstances where it was found that following a 4-year investigation, they had paid bribes in 20 countries for contracts over the last 15 years. And unfortunately, this pattern of bribery involved relations and dealings with Ghanaian public officials as well, who were involved in the sale of military aeroplanes, notwithstanding, as alleged in the prosecution documents, not having any particular experience in aerospace. So, these issues involve major corporate entities in jurisdictions which are perceived as very low bribery risks, but they can most certainly behave in a criminally corrupt way, especially when dealing in countries where the risks are higher. And unfortunately, Ghana is indeed a country which is considered a high-risk jurisdiction for bribery and corruption, as I'm sure everyone knows. I'm going to canter through, as I say, the US FCPA. This is the key legislation concerning criminalizing of payments to foreign public officials, foreign government officials, under US law. It's actually an old law. It's been around since 1977. And maybe Abraham will touch on this, but there certainly has in recent years been a real upward trend of enforcing this law in relation to activities and transactions by companies around the world. And this is very, very much an extraterritorially applicable piece of US legislation. So very quickly, how does it work? The US FCPA basically criminalizes payments made to foreign government officials by entities which are either US entities or have, and I'll put this in colloquial terms, a connection with the United States. And again, it has to be for the purpose of obtaining or retaining business. The lawyers amongst us will understand the expression vicarious liability. This basically means that a company can be responsible for the acts of others involved in their supply chain, in their business dealings, representative companies, third-party intermediaries, JV partners, where the company knows or has an awareness of a high probability that the third party they're working with will commit an FCPA violation on their behalf. This legislation has international reach. It applies not only to US citizens, but also foreign entities that may make corrupt payments within US territory. On the slides are some more detail about the way in which the Act works. I'm actually going to jump that just for the sake of time, so that I can make sure I stick to my time. But the key points to make are that there must be a payment, an offer, or an authorization to pay, or receive or pay anything else of value with a corrupt motive, and the purpose is influence the decision of a decision maker, inducing them to do anything which would be in breach of their lawful duty or otherwise securing an improper advantage for the purposes of winning business. As I say, this does apply extraterritorially. And very importantly for us in Ghana, it applies to foreign nationals employed by US entities. So, that's why quite often if you do get engaged as a Ghanaian, a US company, you'll have to go through a very thorough due diligence process. And you might ask, why am I being asked all these questions which may border on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act when I'm a Ghanaian citizen? I'm sitting in Ghana doing my job in Ghana. Well, because the Act could actually apply directly to you, or apply through vicarious liability to criminalize, from the company's perspective, the acts that you carry out in Ghana. So this is why this type of legislation is so powerful, because it really does apply in a very local context, provided there is a connection back to the US entity. I think it's also worth mentioning about the FCPA that 2 points. One is not on the slides, but the Act does not criminalize the making of routine payments, small facilitation payments. So a payment made to speed up a process, such as a visa or some kind of regulatory renewal, is in a broad sense not the focus of the FCPA. The FCPA is really more interested in those transactional acts of bribery or corruption, perhaps what we might call grand corruption, to win business, between, countries or across borders. But I'll perhaps ask Abraham to make some more points on that. Finally, the final point I'd make on the FCPA is that, as I say, the US Department of Justice is very active in recent years. Levels of enforcement remain high, and that's not just through prosecutions, trials, and convictions, but plea bargains, which involve really large sums of compensation or fines need to be paid by companies. Look, for example, at the Airbus example. Then on the Bribery Act, I think one of the key points to make about the UK legislation is much more recent, came into force in 2011, is that unlike the FCPA, which focuses on bribery of foreign public officials, the UK Act also criminalizes private business-to-business bribery as well. That's one of the key points about it. Second key point about this legislation is that it applies to give unlimited fines, and also to result in prison sentences of up to 10 years in length. So the UK Act is actually in some ways the FCPA on steroids. It doesn't absolve criminal liability for facilitation payments either. And like the FCPA, it has this powerful international reach and can result in a prosecution for any UK citizen, resident, or corporate entity with a connection with the UK. So it's a really pointed piece of legislation. And very quickly, I'll run through what the key offenses are. Active bribery, that's the giving or promising offering of a bribe. Passive bribery, which is the requesting, agreeing, or receiving or accepting of a bribe. It does, as I say, apply both in the public and private sector. Bribing of a foreign public official, and then what is considered a new corporate offense of corporate bribery, where where a company fails to prevent others from performing corrupt services on their behalf. And we'll look at how that offense works, because that's really the key aspect of the Bribery Act for the purposes of this talk today. I'll not go into too much detail on offer and acceptance, but there are various ways in which bribes can be offered or accepted without the paying of money. It can be some other financial or other advantage. But in either of these cases, offer of acceptance, there must be an expectation of improper performance by the public official, or indeed the private corporate entity or individual, in improper performance of their duties as part of the context of offering or receiving the bribe. Some other points to make: in the foreign public official offence, you must be intending to influence them in their capacity as a foreign public official. And I think the only other point I'll make here for the purposes of time is to say, and I think this is really important and hasn't actually been picked up on around the world as much as it might be. An offense is not committed if a foreign public official is permitted or required under applicable written local law to be influenced in their capacity by the offer of the offer of promise or gift. And I just want to really very quickly bring that to our local context in Ghana. The making of a customary gift or indeed payment to a customary leader would generally be considered under the Bribery Act on a strict interpretation to fall foul of the Bribery Act. But this is something that we accept under our customary unwritten law in Ghana. Now, it's generally very public, and actually one could say that if you go to see a chief, amongst all the elders and the Ochiami and the various other people who gather when there are official presentations of this sort, the making of a gift or an offer or the giving of schnapps, etc., is considered customarily as not in any way corrupt. Now, there must be, with these customary activities, a way in which there can be written legislation to permit such activities to take place, falling foul of international legislation like the Bribery Act. And the Bribery Act is actually catered for that. So it's something that would actually give companies a lot of comfort if they could know that there is a regulation under Ghanaian law which permits, in certain circumstances, given safeguards of transparency, etc., to allow such donations and gifts to be given in a transparent and in a way which is not otherwise improper. So I'd just like to flag that defense under the UK Act. Then on to the real, which is the corporate offense. A company or partnership is guilty of an offense if someone associated with the company bribes another person intending to obtain or retain a business or a business advantage for the company. And then critically, the defense for a company, because the company can be liable strictly under the Section 7 of the UK Bribery Act if a third party commits bribery on their behalf, and that third party intends to obtain or retain a business advantage. So the company might have no corrupt intention themselves at all, but may nevertheless be liable for the acts of a third party on their behalf who acts corruptly. So let's bring this to life with an example. You have Company X, a UK company. They've engaged, for example, I don't know, maybe a public relations consultant or a lawyer in Ghana to act on their behalf in a transaction. As part of that transaction, maybe the lawyer goes to see another company or government counterpart, and without the company knowing, pays the bribe on their behalf because it's going to secure, the regulatory permission they need, or the prominent article in the newspaper, etc. That's what we mean by strict liability. The company is liable, notwithstanding they didn't really know or have any intention to commit bribery themselves. And quickly, just to point out, that's different from the US knowledge test or standard under the FCPA, and it's more strict. But there's a corporate defense under the UK Act, which says that if the company can show, so if in these circumstances where the third party has paid the bribe on the company's behalf or for the company's benefit, if the company can show that it had adequate procedures in place to prevent such conduct, then they would have a statutory defense to the corporate offense under the Bribery Act. And I can very happily go into more detail on that if needed, when we come to questions. But there is a very important defense under the Act, which requires a company to show that it had adequate procedures. And very shortly, I'll come on to look at what those adequate procedures might look like. I've touched on penalties already. The FCPA, can give rise to very substantial fines for companies, and indeed in terms of imprisonment. But the UK Act, there are limits to the penalties under the FCPA. But under the UK Act, there is effectively an unlimited scope for fining, and indeed there can be confiscation of gross revenue as a result of the bribery. And there is the ability to imprison for up to 10 years an individual found guilty of an offence under the UK Bribery Act. I just want to touch on the fact that the UK Act has now been in force, of course, nearly 10 years, but there have actually only been 16 prosecutions, according to a Freedom of Information request in 2019. And so that may be considered to be pretty pathetic enforcement of the Act in just some 8 or 9 years when that request was made. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, the UK CPS, the relevant prosecuting and investigating authorities are very, very actively, you know, investigating and pursuing bribery offences internationally. And there are individuals posted in many, many countries and high-risk jurisdictions overseas who are looking at these possible offences. The UK Act is designed to try and prevent corruption, and maybe arguably it has had some of that deterrent effect, and those who are better qualified than me on that matter may have an opinion on that. But it is striking to see that there have only been 16 actual charges or prosecutions in that period. But as I say, there are lots more plea bargains going on, a lot more investigations going on. Let's quickly put this in an international context. You know, there is UNCAC, the UN Convention on Against Corruption, 2005, which has very significantly impacted on corruption, both legislation and anti-corruption programming by organizations like DFID and the EU around the world. As I say, there has generally been a focus on prevention rather than prosecution, on plea bargains. The OECD Convention has led to the UK Bribery Act and indeed to similar legislation in Europe. China has implemented anti-corruption legislation banning corrupt payments to foreign public officials. You'll be interested to know. So this is really building a lot of international momentum. And you know, these risks are genuine and relevant. It's a wonderful revenue spinner for a country to be able to issue a £3 billion plea bargaining fine to a major company. So one can see how these risks are particularly relevant. So let's then wrap this, bring this all together by thinking about mitigation strategies and what under, and I will use the UK Bribery Act focus, what might be the considerations of an organization to ensure that they prevent corruption and they can mitigate and show a defense if they are unfortunate enough to be prosecuted. And just to reiterate, the adequate procedures defense is only a defense under the English law, but not under other laws around the world, but generally has led to an increase in the standards for dealing with corruption mitigation by companies. Key themes of adequate procedures, and I have to go through quite quickly because time is against me. Proportionality of approach. So if you're a very small and very simple company, you don't need to have a huge multinational anti-corruption adequate procedures strategy for dealing with the risks. But think about things like your corporate hospitality, the gifts that you might give maybe to your local registrar general, public official, or your local authority, or those counterparts you're dealing with. Top level commitment, we'll come back to that. Make a risk assessment. Assess really what the risks are in what you're doing. Because if you're, for example, a business-to-business service provider, and you generally don't come across anti-corruption issues, you don't need to have a hugely elaborate anti-corruption policy. Risk assessment requires due diligence and knowing how to conduct an effective and proportionate due diligence in connection with the activities that you're assessing. Communication, including training, monitoring and review of the procedures you have in place, the training you have in place to ensure that each year it's fit for purpose. Some examples of key failings are where there's inadequate due diligence of third-party relationships or before payments are made, failing to take a risk-based approach to due diligence. You might conduct a very basic due diligence and just look at company documents on a transaction without diving any deeper, when actually it's a high-risk transaction and you need to do what may be called an integrity due diligence on the counterpart or third party you're dealing with. Inadequate guidance or training to staff. These issues are not actually straightforward to train on, to teach non-lawyers or people who don't come across these types of risk every day. And one can come across very serious challenges, and I speak from experience, dealing with actually very senior members of staff, very internationally experienced individuals who just don't get why this is even something that should be wasting time in their day to have training on. And of course, failing to establish and record the commercial rationale for payments or for dealing with anti-corruption risks. Moving more positively onto best practice, don't reinvent the wheel is my message. You know, if you have to prepare an ethics and business conduct policy, please make use of what other companies have done themselves. Take published policies of successful organizations and see how to apply them proportionately in your context. And you know, getting that proportionality versus risk assessment right is where you may actually need to take advice, but hopefully advice in a very focused way to get your policies calibrated to your organization. You know, I think most people know what anti-corruption, anti-bribery, business ethics, gifts policies look like. You know, consider the usual suite of policies and how they might be relevant. A whistleblower policy can be one of the most useful tools in anti-corruption, because if someone, and let me put it this way, if someone is kind enough to internally whistleblow to your organization that they think there's a corruption risk, you might discover something is going on which otherwise you might not have been aware of. And if you have a policy which creates another safe space for allowing those issues to be reported, you can then begin to deal with them internally before they spin off into things which are uncontrollable or turn into third-party liability issues, criminal liability issues. And then think about how your policies are backed by disciplinary sanctions. Because it's all very well having these policies in the manual, but if a breach of them doesn't lead to significant sanctions for the people in the organization, then they're fairly ineffectual. Some questions to ask on dealing with third-party risks. Is the arrangement on commercial terms? Is there transparency in the proposed terms of the deal? Is there a link between the services being offered and any business advantage? I'm going to skip through some of these. You can read them on the slides. Conflicts of interest. Are there any unusual connections between people on either sides of the deal? You know, is there any red flag that you've identified which should be investigated more closely? Do you take advice on the particular issue, and have you documented and cleared your decision with appropriate personnel? And you know, this is very closely related to what third-party business partners looking to partner with you will be also concerned about. They'll be looking at what your approaches are to anti-corruption and what policies you have in place and how well you're implementing those policies, thinking about adequate procedures. I think I've talked about the international element and the particular risks that creates, and I think I've touched on quite a lot of these red flags. What I'll do, because of time is against me, is just mention another red flag, which is where there are value for money concerns, payments which you may be asked to make, or a third party may be asked to make on your behalf in another jurisdiction. So a perfectly legitimate looking transaction may actually end up popping up as not representing value for money, and that may be a significant red flag. There are corporate social responsibility and charity risks. So charitable programs or donations, or being asked to make a donation of £76,000 by a public official who's connected with a charity. That's the sharing case. Is a huge red flag. You know, a donation to build toilets in the jurisdiction in which, in the locality in which you're erecting your mobile phone towers, and you know there's an unusually high price for building the toilets associated with the school, etc. These are all red flags which of course need to be investigated and turned down if they're going to too much of a risk for the organization. And then very finally, to say that these issues must really be dealt with from top to bottom in an organization. And as part of the assessment of adequate procedures under the guidelines of the UK Bribery Act, it's really key to have a tone from the top approach, which means that the head of the organization, the leadership, the management of the organization buy into the adequate procedures which have been put in place. They espouse them themselves, and they're not liable for willful blindness when bribery takes place to the benefit of their organizations. And that is actually an aspect of what the FCPA looks at in determining corporate liability. I think my time is up, so I'm really going to stop there. Thank you very much. And we can come back to any of that in more detail in the questions as required. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Korieh Duodu, for that insightful exposition on the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act 2010. Now, our next two speakers are going to, as the saying goes, bring it home. They're going to give us insight into how they have been ensuring compliance in their own organizations. And the very first person to speak is Julian Wrigley, as the country head of financial crime compliance, Standard Chartered Bank, Ghana. So Julian, it's your turn to take the floor. Over to you.
Thanks, Nhyira, and thanks, Korieh, for the very detailed presentation. Unfortunately, because of internal restrictions, I've found it very difficult sharing my slides. We have tried to send it over to Jocelyn. I hope she would be able to share it with the participants after the program. But I'll be presenting from my laptop, and I hope you enjoy this second round of presentation as well. Yeah. Okay, so basically, Korieh has mentioned the legal requirements, what is expected of entities, etc. And like you rightly said, Nhyira, my presentation will basically focus on how we have been implementing these controls after the passage of the Act. So from an institutional point of view, we recognize how critically important it is for us to protect the integrity of the financial system and put a lot of focus on financial crime compliance, looking at money laundering activities, terrorist financing, as well as bribery and corruption related issues. So financial crime itself is high on the agenda of the bank, and bribery and corruption happens to be one of the key financial crime risk types that the bank recognizes and is working seriously towards mitigating any risks against that. And to demonstrate our commitment to the markets in which we operate, we have ensured that we've put in place adequate measures to combat bribery and corruption. And that's in line with our brand promise of being here for good as a bank. Okay, what is our ABC statement? We are saying that the group will demonstrate that it is leading the way in combating financial crime whilst providing quality service to its clients. The group will also continuously improve the design and execution of its anti-bribery and corruption compliance framework and benchmark consistently what is being done by our peers within the industry. So we are sure that at all times we remain on top of this very particular subject. Our mission statement in terms of anti-bribery and corruption, we are saying we will lead the fight against bribery and corruption through the best-in-class ABC program that protects the bank whilst partnering the market, making sure that high ethical standards are adhered to. And in terms of our tolerance, we have a zero tolerance approach when it comes to financial crime compliance, and particularly for bribery and corruption. Basically, we've segregated the risks into two. We have the AML risks, which is more outward to the organization, and bribery and corruption risks, which is more inward. And that's got to do with staff, interaction with clients, interaction with our counterparties, etc. And that's where the risk really is. And you have situations where you have active, passive, bribery, issues about bribing public officials, and also issues concerning corporate liability, which Korieh has explained in details. And we have also aligned our internal definition to the UK Bribery Act in terms of what a bribe is, where we say it's anything of value, which could be in the form of money or cash, jobs being offered, be it paid jobs or unpaid jobs in the form of internships, etc. For the purposes of time, Korieh has mentioned a lot of these, so I will not focus too much on that. Then quickly, I go into our framework as a bank. So we have a governance structure that oversees our ABC framework, and it all starts with the formulation of proper policies and procedures at the top. And then also setting the tone from the top, making sure that organizational culture is right. We also take training and awareness creation very serious, to the extent that we do that for the markets or communities within which we operate through our employee volunteering program. We also do our annual risk assessment, where we evaluate all the possible potential or inherent risk areas, and are able to test the controls that we've implemented to confirm that indeed the controls are working very well on the ground. We also take due diligence very seriously, due diligence in terms of client onboarding, in terms of establishing relationship with vendors, suppliers, intermediaries, in terms of processing manual payments, hiring of staff. All that goes through a vigorous due diligence program. Then we do monitoring and training a lot, and also encourage our staff through various avenues or channels to pick up the suspicious activities and report them for further investigation. And we also do assure our staffs of confidentiality and the fact that they would not be victimized for reporting any wrongdoing. And then, of course, disciplinary action through the HR process, making sure that staff who have flouted the internal regulation are dealt with appropriately to protect the reputation of the bank and as a whole. What are some of the key inherent risk areas that we have identified as a bank? Procurement, dealing with suppliers and intermediaries is key. It's one of the very high risk, inherent risk areas. Hiring practices is also very high risk. And as I go along, I would give an example of some banks that did not adhere to strict hiring processes, or did not have a good framework that had impacted, and there were some fines or sanctions against them. Then also we focus more on business deals. In Korieh's presentation, he talked about dealing with people at a very high level, and sometimes you are surprised the way they take these things for granted and are not serious in terms of bribery and corruption risks. When you are dealing with business deals, it's important that you keep insider information confidential. You do not disclose these informations unnecessarily or without the right authority, because of the impact on the entire deal and the reputational issues that could come out of that. And also because you want to, there's a temptation that people want to unnecessarily gain advantage and make profit out of the deal. So it's important that there are a lot of controls when it comes to business deals relating to joint ventures, acquisitions, and etc. Then also, we talked about, Korieh mentioned gift and entertainment. Within our framework, we also have a lot of policies around gifts and entertainment, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And one area that we focus on is that if there's a local practice which we accept as a normal practice, for which reason it can be done or it's acceptable, then you go for a policy dispensation. And until the policy owner approves the dispensation, you cannot venture into that area. And again, we have a lot of controls around inherent, sponsorship and donations, as well as manual payments. Now, what is the whole operational risk framework? It all starts with the setting out of the policies and procedures and department operating manuals that we deal with. We have 3 lines of controls. We have the first line of control, which is the responsibility of the business or the functional area that is responsible for the deal. It is expected that on a monthly basis, they do an assessment of how well the controls have been implemented. And if there are any issues, they raise them and find solutions or put in place enough mitigation plans to avoid those controls being breached again. We also have the second line of assurance, which is the risk framework owner or risk control owner that has oversight on the activities of the first line of assurance. And then we have our internal audit also coming in as an independent body to examine whatever controls we have complied with and whether they are adequate. If there are any concerns, of course, they would raise them with senior management, and further discussions will be held to determine how best to mitigate those controls. And finally, we have our external auditors and regulatory bodies also coming to assess how well we have implemented our controls. In terms of tone from the top, our group CEO statement says that we have a responsibility to the broader communities which we operate in. Our ethical standards must be beyond reproach, and we must play a robust role in the global fight against financial crime. That is a key role for any bank in the world today, and it's one that we would continue to embrace, and we must remain here for good. And that's what's a quote from Bill Winters, who is our group chief executive. And locally, our chief executive is also aligned to this quote, and basically making sure that there is strict adherence to policies and controls around bribery and corruption. And I gave an example of 2 banks in the UK, Dutch Bank and Barclays Bank PLC, that had practiced bad hiring practices, and that led to Dutch Bank paying $16 million as a fine, and Barclays paying $6.3 million for bad hiring practices. And if you read the case study, basically they didn't have the right policy frameworks in place to make sure that we're actually following the rules. What is our responsibility? We expect our staff to strictly abide with the group code of conduct, which sets the standards expected of each and every one of us. We also expect staff to identify the red flags and report them for further investigations to be done and appropriate measures to be taken to protect the organization. So basically, this is how we have approached implementing a robust anti-bribery and corruption framework within SCB Ghana. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian. And if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A tab and type your questions in there. A few have come through and I'll be putting them across in a moment. But at this point, we move on to our next speaker, Abraham Agbozo, Compliance Counsel for Newmont, Ghana, also to bring his perspectives. And don't forget that he is an American trained lawyer, so and he works for an American business, so he will be speaking directly to how the FCPA is used here in their work. So Abraham, over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nhyira. At this point, I feel like Korieh and Julian covered every blade of grass. I'm not sure that I think I'm superfluous to this whole thing, but I'll give it a shot. And thanks, Alan, in advance for agreeing to run the slides for me. Can we go to the next slide, please? FCPA and Korieh did a good job in explaining its provisions. Before I do that, I just want to point out, just as a way of intro, that compliance programs the world over are almost a response to increased or heightened enforcement of laws like the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. My remit here is just to share with you Newmont's compliance program and how it attempts to address some of the risk arising from these laws. with respect to the FCPA, two sets of provisions, anti-bribery and accounting. I'm going to focus primarily on the anti-bribery provision because it's the biggest, is the elephant in the room for a lot of us. It has broad application, and I'm focusing again on section 10, which is the anti-bribery provision. Broad application applies to companies, to individuals, and to third parties. With respect to companies, the companies have to be majority owned by US interests or controlled subsidiaries. So who's covered by the FCPA? Issuers. And what do I mean by issuers? Companies with securities registered in the US or companies that are required to file periodic reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The FCPA is enforced by two agencies in the US, the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And they work concurrently. The one can fine you and the other can fine you for the same offense. Who does it apply to? Korieh touched on this. US citizens, US nationals, or residents, permanent residents. In addition, companies organized or with primary place of business in the US. And then here is where it touches on some of us here. Foreign persons who take any act in furtherance of a corrupt payment within the US. So here, and I like to give the example of the global football governing body, FIFA, where about 4 years ago, a number of FIFA executives were arrested in Switzerland at the break of dawn. And a lot of them were, most of them were foreign citizens from Nigeria, from Senegal, from Cameroon, I think. And the idea was when they received the payments, it was routed through a US bank. So that kind of satisfied this leg, foreign persons who take any act in furtherance of a corrupt payment within the US. So I like to break down the FCPA anti-bribery provision into its elements. Just indulge me a little bit, because it's important to understand how the elements are applied. Giving or offering directly or indirectly. Directly, the company does that. Indirectly, as Korieh mentioned earlier, agents, contractors, vendors, anybody who speaks on your behalf. So it's not enough, it's not a defense to say, I didn't do it, I being the company. Some vendor who was working for me violated. The actions of the vendor are deemed to be the actions of the principal. Anything of value. There's no de minimis or threshold amount. Anything means anything. To a non-US government official, of course, again, an official. But here's the other kicker: with a corrupt intent to influence that official, meaning that the bribe, the act does not have to be consummated. The person does not have to take the bribe in order for you to fall foul of the provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. All you need to do is to offer with a corrupt intent. And the last one is to secure an improper advantage in order to obtain or retain business. So that intent to secure improper advantage is enough to make you fall foul. It's quite broad in the way it's couched and its reach. I think that if the UK, I mean, the key differences, as Korieh mentioned with the UK Bribery Act, is facilitation payments. That is not prohibited under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And then private-to-private corruption, that is not prohibited. But it attempts more in its grasp than the UK Bribery Act does. There's more attempt in terms of the way the whole provision is couched. So I like to call this my scare slide, because I don't think a lot of people understand the quantum of fines that are levied for violations. And historically, these are some of the fines, between 2 billion and 185 million with Daimler-Benz. But just last week, I think it's the highest with respect to the FCPA so far. It was a $3.3 billion deferred prosecution settlement with Goldman Sachs. The financial penalties were against the Goldman Sachs group and a Malaysian subsidiary. And it was, I don't know, those of you who have been reading the financial news, it was in relation to charges on the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. The fund is called Malaysia Development Berhad. So you can read more on this if you're interested. But this gives you a sense of the amounts in play when there's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act anti-bribery provision. Okay, so having spent some time giving you background, let me now share with you what Newmont has implemented as our response to this terrain. So there's three-pronged or trifurcated, if there's a word like that. There's prevention, there's detection, and then there's correction. So let me start with prevention. Leadership tone, probably the most important aspect of a compliance program, because you can put in place all the requirements under the sentence, under the guidelines, but if your tone by the leadership is wrong, that undermines the edifice that you're trying to build with your compliance program. So at Newmont, we like to say that whatever words, whatever you say as a leader, they're only a footnote to what you do, to your conduct. Employees, we train employees to believe, and they know that senior leaders act ethically and respond appropriately to unethical behavior. If employees see, or if your reports see their managers as honest, respectful, and careful listeners, they're more likely to believe them, they're more likely to take their words seriously, and they are more likely themselves to act ethically. So leadership tone drives everything. And I can give you examples where I think the leadership tone broke down. VW story and was it Starbucks or Uber? I think that part of the problem they had was a leadership tone problem. The next brickwork, if you like, for prevention is values. At Newmont, integrity is a core value of the company, and we do not pay lip service to it. There are visible rewards and consequences for ethical and unethical behavior. We always stress that how you do a task is as important as what you do. So you cannot be an exemplary worker solely based on the effort you put in, but you are an exemplary worker because of how you go about doing it in the right way. Then we have a code of conduct. Now, the rest of the code of conduct policies and code of conduct sits atop a pyramid of governance documents, and the code of conduct is fleshed out in global policies because we operate in all 6 continents. And then the regional standard, the region is Africa region, European region, North America region, South America region, Asian region. So there are standards that, again, in different levels of specificity, flesh out what you're required to do. Then there are site procedures. So in Ghana, we have 3 sites, 4 sites, Ahafo North, Ahafo South, Achim, and Accra. So then these standards are then fleshed out to reflect the realities of a given environment. So we understand that the standard of the global policy gives direction, but as you go down into a country and into the site, there are regional realities and peculiarities that you need to take account of. So that's what the procedures and guidelines do. So there's increasing levels of specificity and clarity as you go down the pyramid. And all these governance documents are reviewed systemically and regularly. So they don't sit atop a shelf and gather dust and are never implemented. But we enforce them, but equally every 3 years, they are reviewed to reflect changing landscape and changing laws and changing operational necessities. Then we do training. We do training, mandatory training 2 times a year in person and online to both employees and contractors on our BRC policies. So every year, if you don't take this training, you're locked out. Your badge is locked out and you cannot enter the site. That's how serious we take training. And then we do outreach. For example, this training, but we also have an ongoing alliance with the German Development Cooperation Agency called Alliance for Integrity. what we do is to train small and medium scale enterprises across the country. We partner with them to do that. What's the rationale? The rationale is, as you create a groundswell of support for ethical behavior and you train people, your engagements with the wider community and stakeholders become easier because you have the same people who buy into the same ethos. But also, it also helps others as they try to build compliance systems in their companies to have a source of support. So that's by way of prevention. But we realize that sometimes prevention does not work. And so there's detection. There's a second safety net, if you like. And basically there are mechanisms and controls. So this annual audit plan, we work closely with the internal audit section to do an audit plan and to identify areas that needs to be audited. There's an enterprise risk management process, ERM process, where across functions, we sit down regularly to assess the risks, think through mitigatory measures and harmonize them to make sure that if HR is working on a mitigatory factor, it doesn't conflict with another mitigatory factor that's being worked on by legal, for example. So that's the ERM process. And then we have a whistleblower portal, integrity helpline. That for me is probably the most important, one of the most important cogs in this wheel. In that there are a lot of things that happen in the company. You're doing all you want, you're doing the prevention, you're doing the detection. But a lot of things that happen that you need people to take ownership and report them. Report not to get somebody into trouble, but report as a mitigating factor against all the risks that we face with respect to our being under the aegis of the FCPA. So there's a helpline that's confidential and that's anonymous, gives you the option of anonymity, that you can report misconduct, violations, inquiries. You can even nominate people who are acting exemplarily to be rewarded, because we believe that you need to reinforce good behavior. In as much as you're trying to deter bad behavior, you need to reinforce good behavior. And all these reports lead to investigations. We track down every report, however trivial it may sound in the beginning, because our experience is that the thing may come out as trivial, but like a cancer, as you go deep and try to understand why the report, it metastasizes. It tends to become something else. So every lead that we get in the tool is chased down. And then when that happens and there's an investigation and there's a report, there are remedial measures, and there's coaching and discipline if that is required. There's a process improvement. We recommend the recommendations from these reports are taken seriously and enforced. This is the control improvements. If there's coaching and discipline, if there has to be a termination because of bad behavior, that also happens. To conclude, the DOJ, Department of Justice, has ramped up the temperature on enforcement. In 2016, they appointed a compliance czar with focus on tracking down compliance, FCPA violations, and enforcing them. There's a broad enforcement scope. If you read the guidelines from 2016 after the appointment of the compliance czar, the scope of enforcement has broadened to cover a lot more than it did. There's a pattern and practice cases. What it means is that after a violation or an alleged violation, and you are investigated, now the statute of limitations do not toll if they find that there's a pattern and practice in the organization. So if they find that whatever is being investigated now, there's been a pattern and practice over the years, they cannot cancel the statute of limitations or extend it. And there are industry sweeps. They go from industry to industry with even, and do systemic random investigations and sweeps to check whether you have your controls, whether there are violations with your books, etc. And then there are multi-jurisdictional investigations. Now, all that means for us as a company is that due diligence, third-party due diligence, is one of our prime areas, because our contractors are deemed to be our agents, and whatever acts they commit are deemed to be ours. So we do regular compliance audits of this contract. We train them. When we roll out training, we train them. but we also do regular compliance where we go and look to their system and see what controls they have in place, whether the controls are enforced and whether the controls are in effect. So in a nutshell, this is our case study. This is the Newmont way of dealing with the risk arising from the FCPA anti-bribery and corruption provisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abraham, for the insights on how Newmont has been ensuring compliance and fighting corruption. It's a big deal. I mean, if we would look back before the Airbus scandal, I mean, one of the key issues that always reared its ugly head around periods like this, ahead of elections, was always about, if you'd remember the Maybe and Johnson deal, you know, involving a foreign or multinational and public officials here in Ghana. Now, we have a few questions. Korieh, I'm going to leverage my position as moderator to get you to answer those questions that I know you've taken care of in the Q&A space, because just for the benefit of everyone quickly, one of the key questions that we've received are from John Brittel. John has quite a few questions, but I'm going to start with a very fast one. It says, can you discuss the negative influence this has had for Western firms versus that of countries where they don't follow these rules, either culturally or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I remember when we were talking about the Bribery Act to companies, I mean, we went to the grass cutter for the British High Commission to host a bunch of British companies in Ghana. One of the key messages was, you know, this is super unfair because we're putting ourselves from a perspective at a commercial disadvantage from, say, Indian or local or Chinese firms, you know, who are competing on the same playing field. And I think, you know, it's a really legitimate issue, but the answer to my mind is twofold. The first point is that there's an expectation that you improve behaviors through this legislation rather than look for prosecutions. And, you know, the whole idea behind it, and I think that's been backed up by the fact that there are only 16 prosecutions at the CPS level. And I don't know if that is right. Maybe there's someone online who might comment on that, who has more up-to-date information, but that's my understanding. So it's not about charging and prosecuting, but preventative measures. And then the second point is, because the OECD, the United Nations, various international bodies are encouraging the same approach, this should mean that this standard of business ethics begins to permeate across jurisdictions. So it's not restricted to Western companies. And another way of looking at that is to say, well, frankly, if you're a huge international company working in a country like Ghana and you've got concerns about competitive advantage, look at it from other companies' perspectives. If they want to do business with you, they're very, very likely to have to implement the same standards themselves. Otherwise, you won't partner with them. And actually, very interestingly, you'll find that when you go through the due diligence processes when doing business in Ghana with Ghana's Ministry of Finance, there are now increasingly very, very detailed integrity due diligence questionnaires and a requirement through, you know, the approaches such as value for money audits to attain those same international standards. So fascinatingly, countries themselves are embracing these standards, even if they haven't implemented a bribery act of their own. That's, you know, momentum which Abraham talked about, how this is sort of catching on internationally, will mean that it does create a level playing field after some time. But of course, it is, John, it is a very genuine concern you've raised.
Okay. Now, a quick follow-up, and this is from Pak Washum, says, many thanks for the detailed presentation. On the topic of mitigation, do you know of any assistance the UK and US governments provide to businesses doing business abroad to level the platform when they compete with businesses from other nations that do not have similar anti-bribery laws in foreign countries. I would believe that this question, Korieh, is tied into another question that you have attempted, well, you've answered. I think that was from Bas Deval, asking, are there any programs in Ghana where staff can follow to deal with corruption? So I think you'll be able to take those two in together.
Brilliant. I mean, there are a few, and I don't want to necessarily endorse any particular one because I only know of a few of the many programs available. But one in particular was actually mentioned by Abraham, which is the Alliance for Integrity program. That, to my mind, is one of the best known anti-corruption training programs. It's usually a day's session with a number of different trainers looking at different aspects of this. So I'd be very happy to say that I think it's backed by GIZ and by companies like Newmont is really excellent, and it is worth looking into. But as I say, there are a number of others. A couple of good places to check would be the GII, Ghana Integrity Initiative, the NGO Ghanaian chapter of Transparency International, and the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition, GACC. And indeed, you can contact the officials at STAC, Strengthening Action Against Corruption, who would also have really good contacts and details of who to link up with to get this kind of training.
Great. Now, Julian, I believe this next question sits in your lap, and this has to do, again, from John. It says, SCB, Standard Chartered Bank, has internal compliance. However, it uses its branch manager to communicate with clients for FCPA issues. This goes in direct opposition to privacy rules for clients. How is SCB managing this?
Well, so I saw the question and wondering how the communication with the branch through the branch was going against the rules. Not holding brief for the branch is something I've noticed. I would pass it on to our corporate affairs department to look at it in detail. But just to say that our approach has basically been to use our relationship managers who are very close to our clients to communicate with our clients on issues that concern our clients. And we believe when we do that, because our clients are more comfortable with the relationship managers, they get to listen to them, and we get to also collect the relevant information that we need in performing our risk assessment and also putting in place the right set of controls. But it's something that I'll refer to the corporate affairs department to further look in, and then we would respond as appropriate.
Okay. Now, the next one is from Caroline Lamptey. Now, Caroline is asking, how confident are companies in Ghana in complying with both international and local laws? And this is the final part of the question. Given the difficulty of implementation of legislation in Ghana, who wants to take a shot at this rather fast curveball?
I think it's only fair.
Abraham, I was going to mention you, so you take it over.
Yeah, you should. I knew you weren't going to let me slide. So before I do that, I just want to ride on the coattails of what Korieh said before about the Alliance for Integrity. Not only do they provide training, but they also provide you with resources and the governance system and documentation that you need to set up and to comply with these laws. So they're an excellent resource for that. And they provide all of that for free. So there you go. So how confident are companies in Ghana in complying with both international? Well, I can only speak from the perch, from a Newmont perch. And the truth is that because of the statutory regime which we are subjected to FCP, there's an internal incentive to comply with these laws. Because with respect to the FCPA, for example, it's strictly enforced, very rigorous about enforcement and tests. So we have to, regardless of the Ghanaian, your concern about the Ghanaian milieu and our penchant for non-compliance with laws and the lax regulatory system. And don't quote me on that. I'm just rolling off your question. With respect to, because of other commitments. So Newmont, for example, is also part of, or we are founders of what is called the Partnership Against Corruption Initiative, a partnership of companies globally, and that we signed up to certain commitments and that are enforced. So because of both the FCPA and PSACG, as we call it, regardless of the general permissiveness of compliance or enforcement in Ghana, we have to do this, we do this, and we follow them strictly.
Okay. There's another question that I think goes to any one of you who would like to take this. Says, as a UK or US company, are you liable under the UK Bribery Act or the FCPA when you donate money to government for the local leadership or government or the local leadership of a town or village to support a meaningful public interest project? And then you find out later that the money is gone and no progress was made. There's been a few examples of this in our news coverage, where the intent was genuine, a hand was extended, but the money didn't achieve what it was supposed to achieve. Where does the liability sit? With the donor, or is the donor under FCPA or the UK Bribery Act liable for money that doesn't end up where it's supposed to? Korieh?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, I think the question of liability will lie with whoever, of course, has squandered the money for that, public interest, good local project. And I think I gave an example in the presentation about, charitable donations or corporate social responsibility projects, and doing the due diligence on them to make sure that, precisely this doesn't happen, that the project constitutes value for money, has the relevant and appropriate transparency safeguards, accounting safeguards to make sure that, funds don't get squandered. I mean, that's one side of it, prevention, but the question is really focused on looking at enforcement. And I would say, if it's a public initiative in the sense that it involves a public authority, a local authority under the auspices of Ghana's laws, then one office which is specifically seized with investigating such issues is the Office of the Auditor General. And that office can actually go so far as to disallow misspent funds and surcharge them directly and personally against any individual or entity found to have been liable for squandering the funds in relation to funds to be used for public initiatives. So that's one aspect of it. I don't think we'd expect to look at this from a perspective of donor liability. But if you are a corporate entity and you've entered into a CSR project and there are conflicts of interest, there are red flags, there are issues around transparency, then as I said on the presentation, that could lead to an offense under one of these international reaching acts like the Bribery Act or the FCPA. While I'm on, I'll just drop a comment on Caroline Lamptey's question about local enforcement of corruption laws in Ghana. It's worth pointing out that actually corruption was only ever categorized as a misdemeanor under Ghanaian law, which meant that you could only get very short prison sentences for corruption offenses. But since June 2020, that Ghana has implemented, enacted an amendment to our Act 29, our criminal law, in response to the UN Convention Against Corruption, actually, to make corruption a felony. So now corruption offenses under Ghana's law are punishable by up to 25 years imprisonment, which is a major step, one would say, in the right direction. But I think the other aspect of Caroline's question is, how do you advise on these issues in the Ghanaian context? We have so many laws all over the place applying to corruption in Ghana. I didn't get a chance to talk about this in the presentation, but actually I think we need a consolidated and easily understandable, accessible anti-corruption law in Ghana. And that would actually help us, level the playing field as well.
Fantastic.
Yes. I think add to more of adopting a preventive approach than exposing ourselves to events of corruption. What it means is that organizations making donations or sponsoring events must have a robust due diligence process in place, where the intent is properly assessed, an assessment is made of the beneficiary, and some comfort is obtained as to the beneficiary using the funds for the intended purpose. So within Standard Chartered Bank, that vigorous internal due diligence is done. It goes through, depending on the amount which is being donated or the sponsorship arrangement, it goes through through top management for approval to be obtained. If the values are really high, some of the approvals are even obtained from the group office before we go ahead to make the donations or sponsorships. And also there are monitoring mechanisms of ensuring that regular reports are received on the project, site inspections are made, all with the aim of ensuring that the funds are used for the intended purpose. So that's more of a preventive approach than just extending sponsorship or support and the funds being used, misapplied for that matter. Thanks.
Thank you. So Isaac Eduhini Opoku asks the following: how do you monitor when an employee refuses to report any kind of bribery to his or her supervisor because he or she is benefiting from the activity? Essentially, how do you smoke anyone being a rat in your organization? Do we get let's go to the back.
Can I take it?
Yeah, sure, Julian.
Yes, so it's about the checks and balances you have in your system. So if you recall, whilst I was doing the presentation, I talked about first line controls, second line controls, and then third line controls. So at the first line, which is a process owner, is responsible to in ensuring that some controls have been put in place, and those controls are tested more regularly, ensuring that it's been adhered to. And if there are any red flags, they raise them for further investigation. The second line comes in, which is a risk control owner or framework owner, comes in to do a dipstick sort of exercise to find out whether the controls are well embedded. And of course, you have the independent function, which is a third line function, most of the time being the internal audit function performing this activity. So if your controls and processes are well embedded, the maker checker controls are in place, you would hardly have surprises. There could be one or two slips, but again, when they happen and you have the right operational risk framework in place, you can always find a solution in addressing the risks that you are exposed to. Right.
So there's a comment that I would like all three of you, Abraham, Korieh, and Julian, to take a shot at debating. And this is from Caroline. Caroline says, I agree that a comprehensive corruption law is required because the new amendment in terms of upgrading corruption to felony does not actually deal with a broader international definition under UNAC or the AU treaty. I don't know, once treaties are mentioned, I think is law and all that, but please take a shot at it. Korieh, Julian, or Abraham, what are your thoughts on these? Would we need to expand our definition of corruption to fit the broader international definitions for it to be effective?
Let me take a shot at this. I am not sure that we need to make it consistent. I mean, it's nice if we can harmonize with international standards, but the efficacy of a law does not rest on its consistency with international practice. I think that it's a step in the right direction by elevating corruption to the status of a felony. But Korieh is also right in saying that you have a myriad of anti-corruption laws, the Whistleblower Act, the Criminal Offences Act, and if you can harmonize them and put them in one consistent form, then everybody knows where to go and they are all aligned. So I think the next step then is to kind of consolidate all these laws into one law. Will they be? I mean, even among states in the United States, there are differing laws. Some crimes are first-degree homicide, and others in another state is not. It is the enforcement, and that, I think we all agree on this. It's enforcement of these laws that make the difference.
Okay.
I do agree with that up to a point, although I think that the advantage of taking account of international standards is the point I think it was John Britell made earlier about the level playing field and the concern that companies feel at a disadvantage if they operate in our jurisdiction against other entities or companies who are held to a different standard. And that's actually bad for business. And to some extent, I think we just have to embrace what is happening internationally. And I don't have any major criticism of the way in which those international standards have been cast. So to that extent, that's where I might differ slightly. And then I think the other point is that we just haven't taken account of our local peculiar context. These laws are just restatements of the old English common law, frankly, under our Act 29. Our criminal laws are not fit for purpose. They're, over 50 years old. And for example, the issue about local customary rights could be one that we could address. And there are various other customary issues we could think about and deal with more specifically. We could do a better job than the Bribery Act, I think. And we could also make the law more comprehensible. Actually, if you try reading the Bribery Act, it's extremely difficult to follow if you're not a lawyer. It's drafted in a very convoluted way, to my mind. And, actually, I think the FCPA suffers from a similar malaise that a lot of US legislation suffers from. It's just frankly too wordy and a kitchen sink at a problem which we actually need to bring home to society as a whole. So for those reasons, I think we there is a lot of justification if you're genuinely serious about tackling corruption of enacting a proper law to deal with it. And maybe that's the big question for me, is how genuine is the sentiment in Ghana amongst politicians to deal with corruption properly.
Wonderful. So I get a sense, I'm going to take Pak Washum's question again, Korieh. I think that the tail end of the question, I actually bundled two questions in one, and I think I feel we got an answer to the second part more in more detail than the first. I'm just going to take this. On the question, on the topic of mitigation, do you know any assistance that the UK or US government provide to businesses doing business abroad to level the platform when they compete with businesses from other nations that do not have similar anti-bribery laws in foreign countries? I don't know if that still speaks to the idea of talking to institutions or organizations like the ones Abraham mentioned.
Well, I'll have a go at making a suggestion, which is frankly right under our noses. The private sector anti-corruption group, set up with funding, and now I think AmCham and local limbs of major international companies, all of us contributing here in this safe space, to my mind, is an amazing opportunity. This group actually has access to government, to go to government with problems and say, we need your help to tackle these issues. And I think, when this was set up, the whole idea of the safe space was to be able to share frankly the challenges of doing business in Ghana with the concerns we have about corruption. And so, I would say this type of platform is invaluable. It's pretty innovative as well. I haven't seen a platform like this, operating in this way with the type of government access that it does. And hopefully going forward, it can bring together what the real problems are, and then, get some action to help companies navigate them.
Awesome, awesome, awesome stuff. Okay, so I have about 2 or 3 questions. What this has to do with one, the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there's been a terrible impact on movement, on supply chain management, and things like that. Hitherto, some organizations or multinationals would have inspection teams that would move around to ensure that compliance is adhered to. What are the lessons that we can point to because of the impact of COVID-19, and what are also the difficulties that the lack or the restriction on movement may have created in ensuring that compliance is at its best? Abraham?
Okay, thanks, Nhyira. I think the biggest problem is disruption to supply chains. And what I mean by that is, so with the onset of COVID-19 and with a lot of companies having challenges in their operations, there's a niche arose where you have a set of vendors that you've been dealing with for the past years, and then these vendors are having challenges, and then you have other vendors who are coming up in this COVID-19 environment who appear to be nimble and are tuned to the needs of companies during this pandemic. The dilemma is, do you go with these ostensibly nimble new players, or do you help your existing supply chain vendors, augment them, assist them to rise up to the challenge? Now, from a risk perspective, if you have run these existing ones through your audits and your due diligence, I think the safe bet is to work with them, to bring them up to speed and to continue to use them. Because within a crisis, if you have a company that comes through within a crisis, who is new and during a crisis, there are a couple of red flags that should go off. And do you have the time and the wherewithal within such a crisis to make sure that you subject them to a thorough due diligence? So that is a challenge, and various companies have dealt with it differently. I mean, I think the practice is to go with established vendors and make sure that you augment them and continue your due diligence on them to make sure that it do not violate the laws that govern you in terms of corruption.
Is there any further thoughts on this?
Well, from a banking perspective, StanChart had embarked on a digital agenda about 2 years ago. So, I mean, coming into the era of COVID, there hasn't been much impact because a lot of our products and services had been brought to the doorstep of the client. And basically, it was for us to invest more in technology, making sure that the security systems we had in place in securing client transactions and protecting client interests was well embedded and working very well.
Okay.
Again, we had also various initiatives in getting our staff to work from home. So it was something that had already been rolled out, and we had some staff working from home. It gave us the opportunity to really, initiate that process of getting most people to work from home. And currently, as I speak, we have a lot of our staff working from home and very few operating from the office. And it's interesting times. We are monitoring closely, of course, ensuring that the security systems are also working very well in terms of client confidentiality, processing of transactions, and also our clients enjoying the convenience of banking from home. Yeah, so it's worked so well for us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So another question, which is a very important one, is got to do, and this is from Charles Nixon Yaboa, coming through on the Facebook. It says, how do we address the bottlenecks in terms of doing business in Ghana and how that promotes graft? I know there was a mention that I think I made routine payments is sort of not looked at. Is the main transactional acts of bribery that are looked at. But if essentially the things you ought to do, the bottlenecks, and you need to keep, oil in the pipeline to get things done, doesn't that affect the overall desire of the UK Bribery Act, as well as the FCPA and the general corruption fight? Who do I give this one to? Any one of you can try that, but let's hear from you, Julian, on this one.
Well, I'm finding it difficult to understand the question.
Okay, so the number of things that have made, okay, a number of things have made it difficult for people to do business in Ghana. One of the key examples that come to mind readily is the speed with which you can incorporate a business and be up and running in, say, Rwanda compared to Ghana. So how do we fight, or how do we make progress if we're fighting corruption in the light of some of these bottlenecks?
Okay, so it's all, it's basically on what your company corporate policy is like, what controls you have put in place to mitigate, bribery and corruption risks, and how well you get your staff or your counterparties to appreciate the reason why, as much as possible, we must minimize the risks that we are exposed to as we do business. And that got to do with a lot of training of your staff, building of capacity internally and externally. For us, for example, this year, we selected a couple of strategic clients who we organized a compliance program for, and we positioned it such that if you build the right compliance culture, you have the right policies and procedures in place, you have trained your staff to the competencies that is required, and they are doing the right thing, then it gives us the opportunity to also enter into business with you and do more with you. So I would say it should basically be driven by corporate policy and the commitment from management and all staff in ensuring that the right thing is done. Yes, from that angle, I believe we can make the impact which is required.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great question. Thanks to Julian for giving me a little bit more time to think about it. But, I think I agree with everything Julian has said for sure. And, some other very good points have been made around training. Abraham's mention of, the raising awareness around these issues. But very briefly, to address this, it seems to me, first of all, I'd like to say, I think we're doing an awful lot of good in Ghana. And we always look at countries like Rwanda. If you want to set up a company in Ghana, it might take you 3 days. You wouldn't have to bribe anyone. Okay. It could potentially all be done digitally, and you'll have your company documents. So, the Registrar General's Department is, I would say to a large extent operating, the Registrar of Companies operating with integrity, and that's to be celebrated. And there is increasing digitization. Some of these efforts have been more successful than others. We know that. But if you digitize your ports, if you digitize the way in which you put your passports in as you're leaving the country, etc., you're reducing the risk of human interference. So that's really an aspect where we've made some progress. But there are whole programs like the STACK program, which are looking at this issue and spending millions of pounds trying to work out how to tackle corruption at these levels. And I think if there were a STACK expert here, they'd talk about how you've got to address all aspects of the anti-corruption chain, from the public sector to the private sector, to the media, to civil society, and how they all work together. It's one of the biggest challenges in society at the moment to try and address this issue. We can't do it in time. We can't do it justice here. But what businesses can do, and I think I am happy to say I have a personal experience of seeing this with some of our clients, is if you stick to your guns and you say, we have a zero tolerance approach to corruption, and you communicate that and you back it up with the right corporate infrastructure, like companies like Stanchart and Newmont do, you parade those standards to those who are likely to request rents, as it's called, you find that very quickly they melt away. And when they realize that, one, they have to do business with you because the commercial imperative or the policy imperative is too strong, and two, you are not willing to play that game, ultimately you get a reputation for doing things the right way, and it goes around that you're not to be messed with and you will not tolerate such behavior. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And actually the converse also applies, in that if you give the impression, and I have seen examples of this many times as well, I'm sure Abraham has in his practice, private practice too, if you give the impression that you are willing to pay a bribe just once, every single time you go to that public institution, you're going to be requested to pay that bribe, and your reputation is finished. You'll never be able to do business properly with officials who were otherwise happy to do business properly. So it really does cut both ways. And those companies that want to operate with integrity need to really fight hard to do so and mitigate risks, and work as hard as possible with their counterparts to ensure that they can adhere to the standards they are setting for themselves.
How does a multinational ensure that they're limited or shielded from potential risk where the business that they are working with or a third party in the value chain of their operations operates or is registered, incorporated in a tax haven? Say someone sets up a company runs here in Ghana, but the parent company is owned by another in Mauritius. How does the multinational ensure that you are limited from the exposure that an organization such as that could bring you? Abraham. All right, Julian wants to go. So okay. Abraham, you can let Julian take a lead and then you go after him.
Okay, so it's basically around the due diligence controls that you have. I mean, looking at the example you gave, it relates more to banking, where we have clients registering in tax havens and also wanting to do business with us locally. So your framework, which basically must be guided or based on the principles of adopting a risk-based approach, will help you do your due diligence. And when the risk indicators or factors have been plugged in, it should tell you the appropriate risk rating and the set of controls that you need to comply with, or set of extent to which due diligence has to be performed. Where you have performed due diligence and the classification is high, what it means is that there must be more monitoring of the client activities. There must be more scrutinizing, transactions performed by the client, trying to know the reason and purpose for the transactions and why specific products have been selected and being used by the client. And at any given time where you are not comfortable, nothing stops you from going back to do your due diligence once again, because the client's dynamic could change over time. So it's first of all getting it right during onboarding, also putting in place a lot of systems to continuously monitor activities of the client, and going in, as and when required, to upgrade whatever risk assessment you have performed on the client. And sometimes it even leads to exiting of the client. And in terms of monitoring, you're not just looking at transaction monitoring, you're looking at media monitoring, you're looking at counterparty review, transactions, etc. So there are a couple of controls that are normally applied to make sure that any risks that the financial institution is exposed to is properly addressed.
Abraham?
Yeah, I think Julian covered good ground here. So, of course, the big thing is due diligence, but not the generic due diligence or risk assessment, but a tiered one. So when I say, so you can have 4 tiers of risk: highest risk and lowest risk. And you have different parameters and things, or a checklist for all of them. First of all, the parameters that tick off that heightened due diligence for a vendor, but then also your matrix for looking through or for assessing them is higher. So you have a tax haven, which means that some level of beneficial ownership that you are not able to ascertain because of however the law is structured there. But then it means that before the person passes to be a vendor or a contractor, your due diligence checklist must tick a few boxes, and you should not apply the same kind of assessments as you would a lower risk vendor. So you've got to tier it and make sure that it's tailored to fit the risk that that vendor, given where it's incorporated or given where he chooses to conduct business from, poses to you. That's all I want to add to Julian.
Okay, so I'm fielding the next 2 questions and then we can wrap up. And this has to do with Adobe Akwesin asking, how do you implement your tone from the top culture on corruption issues? And that, I think we'll go to Korieh for that one. Actually, Korieh explained it in his presentation. I think we should do that. Let's go to Abraham for the tone from the top. And the final question is corruption always tied to money? And that I would ask Korieh to answer.
So the short answer is you hold your leadership accountable in the same way that you hold everybody else. So we have a lot of cultures. I mean, I've worked different places where the way top management is cut some slack when it comes to certain actions. We almost apply different sets of values or systems to people who are lower down the food chain. Now, if that is your paradigm that you're working in, then you have a problem. Then the tone at the top would not be effective. But if you have a paradigm where everybody held to the same standard and people see visible consequences and incentives for leadership, the same thing, the same consequences and incentives for leadership as they see for other levels of employees, then that tone at the top begins to have meaning, and it's just not words.
Wonderful, thank you, Korieh. Does bribery and corruption only have to do with money?
Yeah, just to first of all add to Abraham's point, and the tone from the top is best illustrated by the company that doesn't employ that strategy, where there are huge efforts made to implement an anti-corruption policy. It's a serious disciplinary offense, but in that company, there's a culture where if it's approved or okayed by the MD or senior management, then it's basically fine. And that brings the whole structure crashing down, and therefore nobody has any interest in implementing and supporting such a strategy. So, that top level buy-in, Adobe is absolutely right, is absolutely critical. And a huge effort has to go in sometimes to make that stick with senior management, who sometimes think they're immune somehow from this this sort of consideration and culture. Yeah. So as mentioned in the presentation, the giving or receiving of a bribe does not have to do strictly and solely with a financial transaction. It can be any sort of benefit in kind, including a coveted place at a private school, tickets to a particular match, or even a promise in future to give you an opening or an opportunity. Oh, implement this project with us, and we will give your guys a few places on the board when we set up our local entity. These are all effectively criminalized bribes, certainly, under the UK legislation, and I think under the US as well. So it certainly doesn't only have to do with financial transactions, anything of value, which is capable of being promised, offered, or received.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. I think at this point, if you have final words 30 seconds each from Abraham, Julian, and Korieh. In 30 seconds, let's have your final words as we wrap up.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure participating here, and I learned a lot. So thank you for inviting me to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Julian?
Yes, thanks also for inviting me to this program, and for all our participants. It's good embedding a good compliance culture that gives you more credibility, gives you leverage to do business with international organizations and grow your business. So please take compliance serious. Thanks.
Yes, I'll just emphasize that point. It's been a huge pleasure, but please remember, we don't need to pay lip service to bribery, because catching bribers is big business now. And there are huge awards and rewards being offered out in certain jurisdictions. So take this really seriously. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. The private sector-led anti-corruption group, Strengthening Action Against Corruption Ghana, UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce, and the American Chamber of Commerce. Now, if you're not yet a member, I recommend that you choose which of the two, if not both, that can help you advance your business. The UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce can be reached through the membership engagement manager, Margaret, and she's on 054-012-6619, and she'll be happy to take you through what they have to offer. You can find them on Facebook. It's UK Ghana Chamber of Commerce. And the American Chamber of Commerce, you can go to amchamghana.org and /how to join, how-to-join, or in fact, you go land on the landing page and you should be fine. And you can also call 0302-247-562. I as well have learned a lot, and it's been an honor and a privilege to have moderated the session. It's always a pleasure engaging with Abraham, Korieh, and Julian. It's nice meeting you as well. I will certainly be hounding you for more lessons. So God bless you all. My takeouts from this is critical that every business, irrespective of your size, must be abreast with new knowledge. So you don't stop learning about the subject matter, the amendments to the laws as they come. Seek understanding so you know how it affects you and your business. So if you need to adapt or change the way you do things, you're able to align. Number two is that it's important that you don't just write a framework, but you must live that framework. So you can write a code of ethics, but as Korieh said earlier, if you have a system where the culture allows the CEO to essentially, based on his whims and caprices, agree to certain things that may be in breach of written down code, then you have a problem. So you must live that framework and must provide leadership at all levels. So both the little guy or the least in the organization and the highest in rank in the organization have an equal opportunity to ensure that corruption is tackled. And the fourth thing is constant training, that everybody internally and externally, from the both the Newmont and Standard Chartered Bank examples, your touch points must be aligned to the visions and the culture of the business. So your security guards outside the branch should not be doing things small for the boys when your customers are leaving, because that becomes a weakness in the chain that can be exploited for future cost to the business. The other thing is that, well, this is for everyone, that you model the ways, but more importantly, you must enforce. So if people make mistakes, if people infringe on these rules, you must enforce them. If we can't enforce it at our level, we'll forever complain about lack of enforcement elsewhere. So thank you all very much, and God bless you all. Please be safe out there, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.